If what David Grusch is saying is true, everything that we know about the world will change. If what this man has been saying is true, everything that you envisaged about your future changes. Everything we envisaged about the world that we live in changes. So this is either the most earth-shattering thing ever, or it's complete fabrication, and we need to work that out as soon as possible. In this world of ufology, it's really easy to get carried away and excited when someone comes out and says something fascinating that corroborates what we already believe. But I really think probably the most useful thing we can be doing right now is asking ourselves, what are the different possible explanations as to why someone might say these things? What could be the motivations and the interests that would drive someone to say something like this, other than the possibility that he might genuinely be telling us the truth? So today I've got 6 theories, 6 possible interpretations of David Grusch that we can run through. At a high level, this is what they are. Number 1 is he's mad or crazy, right? He's lost his mind, or he's just unable to think clearly. Number 2 is he's not lost his mind, but he's just genuinely mistaken. He's misinterpreted the facts and the data. Number 3 is that he's bad and he's purposefully misdirecting us for some selfish purpose that's going to benefit himself, either monetarily or in terms of purpose or a sense of importance, or perhaps a wider group of people that he's associated with. Number 4 is a bigger version of this previous one. In number 4, we're talking about a PsyOp. This is the Department of Defense or some shadowy part of it purposefully trying to misdirect our thinking in order to get us to think about the world in a way that serves their purposes. Number 5 is that he's telling the truth, but it's a very constrained version of the truth. This is basically the Department of the Defense or some elements within it saying, hey, this is going to come out, so we better make sure that we control the narrative in a very specific way so that we don't lose control over this whole situation. And number 6 is the final one, which is that he's a genuine whistleblower and he's saying, hey, there's some bad things happening and I'm here to tell you what they are because I think people should know about it. So those are the 6 options we're going to run through today. I think we can deal with the first 2 together. The idea that he's crazy, that he's unable to think clearly, and then the slightly more diet light version of this where he's just stupid enough that he's misinterpreted normal documentation for something completely outlandish and conspiratorial. The first thing to say is we have no way of knowing whether David Grusch has lost his mind, right? Just because he looks like a sober, rational individual doesn't mean that his marbles haven't gone completely wild. So it's completely possible, it's logically possible, and it's one of the options that we should all keep on the table that, maybe David Grusch has just lost his head. Maybe he's not thinking clearly. That being said, I think there are some arguments against this. First and foremost, when you watch someone being interviewed and you read their body language, you get a sense of the person. And just on that intuitive human level, this guy looks like a reasonable, rational person who thinks clearly and knows how to communicate thoughtfully, and also understands how outlandish some of his claims will sound. He's not sitting there saying, hey, this is what's going on, and of course you're going to believe it because it's the truth. He's actually being a lot more tempered. He's saying, look, I understand this sounds crazy, but this is what I found. So that's the first indication that this is someone of a sound mind. They recognize that these pretty big claims that are being made will be shocking and hard to grasp for people because they're outside of the realm of normal possibilities that we consider. That strikes me as someone who's grounded. But really, the biggest argument for him not being crazy and not being stupid is the fact that he's got a huge resume that indicates the Department of Defense took this person to be highly trustworthy. Here are some facts about David Grusch. He got a BSc in physics, studying with the United States Air Force. He then went on to get an MA with honors in intelligence studies. He served in Afghanistan. He then spent many years in the National Geospatial Agency and the National Reconnaissance Office. And I think most importantly, as I mentioned in a previous video, David Grusch was given huge broad access to thousands of special access programs. I want to reiterate this, and I'm sorry if you've heard me say it in the previous video, but this is just an enormous deal. I actually have experience working in cybersecurity, and one of the biggest principles that you'll have in that industry is a concept called least privilege. Least privilege is a principle where you say, look, for any individual, they should have the least amount of privilege, the least amount of access they require in order to fulfill their job. Why? The reason is that if that person gets compromised or if they become a malicious actor with bad intent, they only have so much power available to them to be exploited. It's a very wise and thoughtful practice. In the Department of Defense, do you think they apply this principle? Of course course they do. They don't want to have too much privilege for any individual. They don't want to have a bucket of powers that someone can steal and use to exploit them. So in the Department of Defense, for the most part, people are not going to be given broad, sweeping access to very sensitive programs. They're just not. It goes against every single principle of security and cybersecurity. But in some cases, it may be necessary for functional and operational purposes. So you are going to have a very, very small select group of people who will be given that access when it is deemed necessary. Now, on that shortlist, who are you going to have? You are going to have the most trustworthy, loyal, sound of mind, and reliable people in the entire Department of Defense, which, by the way, is the largest employer in the world. So who ends up on this shortlist? David Grusch. I think that's everything that you and I need to know about this person in order to answer the question, is he someone who might lose his mind? Is he someone who might misinterpret the facts? Is he someone who could be so stupid as to misinterpret ordinary testimony, ordinary classified documentation, ordinary classified conversation, stuff that he's already familiar with, having briefed the President of the United States of America in his previous role? Is he someone who would be so stupid as to misinterpret this for the sorts of things that he's saying? I don't think I need to answer that question. I'll leave that to you, but personally, that is enough for me to put aside the idea that he's mad or that he's stupid. So let's move on to the next area, which I think is a bit more interesting. This is where we're beginning to ask, not is he crazy, but is he bad, right? Does he have some bad motivation? And if you remember, we're going to split this into two. So first, we're going to ask, is it somehow beneficial for him, or perhaps for a wider group of people around him, to benefit from going out and saying a bunch of things that aren't true, and maybe to somehow make money or to build a reputation off of this? I've had trouble imagining a circumstance where this theory makes sense, but let me throw out something here. What if David Grusch, being 36 years old, having worked incredibly hard during his career, has decided, you know what, I can see there's a big ufology industry out there. There are people who sell books, there are people who are on tour all throughout the year, who go from conference to conference, they do interviews, and I want to see if I can do that because I want to travel, I want to make money, and I want people to think I'm great. I can imagine there are people out there in the Department of Defense who would be selfish enough and tired enough that they might imagine doing something like that. I think it's logically possible. So how would you go about doing something like that? I suppose you would come out and say a bunch of stuff, wouldn't you? You would come out and say a bunch of things and say, you know, I saw this and I was here and I was there. But here's the thing. David Grusch has said these things under oath. Now, I'm not a resident of this beautiful country of the United States of America. I'm still here right now, by the way. I'm in a very bland hotel room in Oceanside, California. I'm not a resident of this country, but I do understand that when you lie under oath, when you lie to Congress, when you lie to the Senate, when you lie to your fellows in the Department of Defense, there are serious consequences that can include jail time. Now tell me, if you are a 36-year-old who is clearly at the very top of his game, he has an incredible career ahead of him, I'm sure he's going to make a lot of money, have an incredible reputation, and be highly esteemed, not only within his workplace, but by the world around him, right? And he has now decided, you know what, I'm going to go out for some purpose and get loads of attention, maybe he's going to try and sell a book, and what he does is he lies under oath. Are you going to tell me that someone who is bright enough and sharp enough to rise up to those levels at the age of 36 is stupid enough to start their new career by lying under oath? I personally don't buy it. So I'm going to put that theory aside as well. Now, I'd be really interested to find out if someone else has a different theory about how David Grusch might stand to benefit from these circumstances. If you have an idea, put it in the comments. Genuinely, I want to think about it. The next one is a bit more interesting to me, and I think it's the one that's floating around online a lot at the moment. It's the idea that yes, there is a bad motivation, but it's not specifically coming from David Grusch. This bad motivation is actually coming from the Department of Defense, or perhaps some smaller element within the Department of Defense, and that is that this is some sort of psychological operation. Now, in preparation for talking about this, I did look around and try and find examples of psychological operations like this, and to be honest, I've struggled. But I have got 3 examples that we can use to hold up and say, look, these were psychological operations. These were false flags designed to misinform the public, or to perhaps misinform a group of politicians to change their behavior to suit the needs of some shadowy group. Okay, so here are the 3 examples that I've got. The first one was the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Now, you have to excuse me, I'm not a historian of these things, so if I get some details slightly wrong here, I apologize, but hopefully this is going to serve our purpose of analyzing David Grusch. In the Gulf of Tonkin incident, you had a United States Department of Defense and executive branch who wanted to go to war with Vietnam for some economic, geopolitical purposes. The Vietnamese did attack a boat, but there was a second boat that the Americans claimed was also attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin, and it turns out in reality, this boat was never attacked. This was actually fabricated, and there were some excuses made, like, oh, you know, we misinterpreted some communications operations. But these days, people tend to realize that this was actually a psychological operation played by the Department of Defense upon politicians and the general public in the United States to build the perception that the Vietnamese hadn't just attacked a single boat, but were attacking multiple boats. That is, they had a pattern of warmongering behavior towards the United States and therefore constituted a much bigger threat. What was the purpose here? To motivate America to go to war with Vietnam. Okay, now the second example of a PsyOp we've got is Operation Northwoods. This actually never happened, but this is one of a group of possible ideas that the Department of Defense had to try and motivate the United States public to support a war with Cuba. At the time, they were extremely worried about their possible relationship with the Soviet Union and also the economic consequences for America with how Cuba was handling their economy. What has surfaced over the years is a bunch of documents that show the United States Department of Defense was proposing plans for a kind of false flag that would motivate the American population to support a war with Cuba. For example, in a memorandum which is now public, you can see that the Joint Chiefs of Staff were considering impersonating Cubans to then attack American citizens and American assets with a view to then blame Cuba and say, hey, look what Cuba did. Aren't they awful? They're attacking us. We need to make sure that we defend ourselves against them. There was also another operation proposed called Dirty Trick, which I think is a really apt name for this. The idea here was that if the Mercury space flight was to fail or crash in some way, they would then blame this on Cuba. A slightly different angle where instead of creating an event, you're taking a real event, a real tragedy that's occurred, but saying that was Cuba's fault. So a similar concept here. And the final one we've got is the Iraq War, and specifically in my home country, the United Kingdom, the problems that arose with the motivations for going to a war. There was a dossier that was created under pretty dodgy circumstances. It turns out that a lot of it was just directly plagiarized from a source who turned out to be lying. In the dossier itself, that individual's spelling mistakes and funny ways of saying things can clearly be seen because it was copied word for word and then was taken by the head of MI6, and between Tony Blair and a couple of other people, they basically, without checking the intelligence, without verifying it, took it to the Houses of Parliament and said, hey, Saddam could attack us within 45 minutes, and here is the intelligence that shows that this is the case, and the Parliament had no way of verifying whether that was true. 3 instances. Okay, now, what have they all got in common? In each of these cases, the structure of what's going on is very similar. You have a target audience, so that's the American people or politicians or the British Parliament. There's a group of people that need to make important decisions. There is an event that's occurred somewhere far away, usually. It's in Iraq, it's in Vietnam, it's off the coast of the United States, places that these people can't go and verify. They're not first-hand witnesses to what's happened. And then there is some sort of covert interception of the standard data. So rather than getting the information about what really happened, because we don't have direct access to the events, the intelligence agencies basically intercept and create or modify or change the data so that the people making the decisions now have a warped perception of what's really happened. Now, what makes these PsyOps so effective? It's this. Firstly, they happen in a high-pressure situation. So in the case of the Iraq War, the British politicians were being told Saddam could attack us with WMDs within 45 minutes. In the case of Cuba or Vietnam, there is a war beginning and people are dying and people are being attacked. This creates an emotional environment where making rational decisions becomes harder because we're under pressure and we're under this sense that we need to act now, which is quite different from we need to act rationally. As well as this, the data that we're using to make the decisions is completely abstracted from the real events that have happened. And most importantly, we have no way of verifying whether that data is correct. Take the Iraq dossier. Now you can look at it and you can read it, and Tony Blair might tell you this is exceptional intelligence, which is what he did tell Parliament, but you have no way of going and verifying and checking this, especially with the time constraints and the pressure that you're under. There would be no way of going and checking those data points. The next thing you're going to notice is there is a clear action which we're being motivated to take. In all 3 of those cases, what is it? It's going to war and proactively attacking another nation or a group of people to protect and defend ourselves. The outcome in all 3 of those cases is extremely clear what we should be doing. And finally, the relevant authorities are all unified in their stance on this issue, whether that's the Prime Minister, the Department of Defense, the President, and also the media as well. They're all playing along in creating a single unified narrative where there's not much room to debate or discuss the other possibilities. So these are 3 examples of psychological operations, and those are the characteristics that make them so effective. So now, let's look at David Grusch and ask ourselves, does it look anything like a good, solid psychological operations that we're all brought up with? I think the answer is a resounding no. Let's look at the data points first. David Grusch isn't just saying one thing. He's saying a bunch of quite complicated things. In a good psychological operation, you make one really clear point, which is there are WMDs, this boat was attacked, this incident happened. David Grusch is saying there has been a 90-year cover-up. We have recovered craft, and quite a few of them. We have recovered pilots. There is a disinformation campaign and a stack of other things. This is a lot of different things that could potentially be falsified. This is a lot of different things that could be empirically tested. This brings us to the next point, which is that the things David Grusch is saying can be falsified. Now you might say, but wait a second, there's been no evidence presented, and you'd be absolutely right. To you and to me, we have no way of looking at the documentation or speaking to the people that David Grusch has spoken to. But you know who does? The House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and the Director of National Intelligence have all been briefed on this. And I can give you a list of the people and their names. You just need to go online, I'll put the links in the description, and you can find all the different senators and congressmen and women who have been briefed on this. Now, some of them won't have access to all of the data, right? They won't have the clearances, but they have been briefed, they have been told where to find this information, who to speak to, what the code names are, as has Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines. So when it comes to falsification, this is a pretty bad PsyOp, because if this is just a game, then David Grusch has basically said you're going to find it here, 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 and here you need to speak to these people, which means that PsyOp can be completely undone. The only way this works is if every person on that committee is also in on the scam. As well as this, the Inspector General of the intelligence community would also have to be on board, as would the private law firm, Compass Rose, that David Grusch used to submit his complaint. So we've got a broad spectrum of people who all have to be in on the game for this psychological operation to work. But here's the thing, it's not just those people who would have to be in on it. See, there's a broader range of authorities that you usually need to have on board for a psychological operation to be effective. You want to make sure that there is a broad agreement and consensus from the authorities that matter in order to drive people towards the action and the outcome that you want. But where are the media on this? So far, the only media organizations who have directly covered this are The Debrief and News Nation. To be honest, those are two pretty low-level news organizations. It doesn't mean the journalism is bad. To be honest, I've been very impressed by the level of detail in the reporting. However, this isn't the New York Times. This isn't the massive media organizations that the Department of Defense has relationships with. And if this is a PsyOp, the risks of being discovered and the possible implications of that would be enormous. And you would think that the Department of Defense or the elements within it that are playing this game to try and get us to do something would make sure that the media was all on board and firing from the same cylinder. You'd also assume there'd be some executive level endorsement going on, but so far that's completely absent. A couple more issues. In terms of urgency, where is it? Now you might say, look, in the interview David Grusch says that there has been malicious activity on the part of non-human intelligences, and that is ominous and that is concerning, and that certainly played up during the interview. But he also tells us that there has been a 90-year cover-up and indicates that the non-human intelligence seems to be somewhat ambivalent towards humans and what they do. That to me doesn't seem like a very high-pressure situation. That to me doesn't look like a situation where we're trying to create an emotional environment where it's hard to make a rational decision. It strikes me that really what David Grusch is saying is, look, there's a kind of a status quo here where the world will continue to be as it is as far as we can tell, because whatever this non-human intelligence is, it seems to be pretty passive or ambivalent towards us to some extent. So again, where is the high pressure button? Where is the emotional volatility of the situation that is designed to get us to make bad decisions? And finally, most importantly, what is the decision that we're supposed to be making? Did you notice that the biggest threat presented in the interview was not Russia, not China, not the non-human intelligence? It was the sophisticated and unethical disinformation campaign conducted by who? People within the Department of Defense. That to me is the biggest indicator that this is not a PsyOp. And if it is a PsyOp, it is an exceptionally sophisticated PsyOp being played by who? I would expect Russia or China or someone who wants to stir dissension and division within the Department of Defense, because that is the only thing that's going to be accomplished by David Grusch's testimony. So again, whereas in other psychological operations and false flags that we have some evidence of, there is always an outcome which is designed to push us towards war with a foreign group. In this case, we absolutely do not have that. We are being driven towards war with what? A faction of people who are operating within the Department of Defense and with government funding. This just seems very different from the traditional PsyOps and false flags that we've seen in history. I'm not saying this is not a false flag. I'm not saying this is not some kind of psychological operation. And to be honest, if you have any ideas about how this could work with what we've seen so far, then let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely really interested. But for now, I think that's a pretty extensive and deep coverage of the possibility of a psychological operation. I'm going to keep this one on the table, but only under the conditions that this is not a psychological operation being played by the Department of Defense, but instead is being played by a foreign adversary or some other group of people who want to cause dissent and division and confusion within the United States. Now, the next option is that this is some kind of genuine disclosure, but it's a constrained disclosure. So this is basically the Department of Defense saying that the doors have been blown open over the last number of years with all the conversations and people coming out. So we need to make sure that we discuss this, because we're not going to get away with hiding it anymore, but we're going to discuss it in a way that makes sense for us. Here's the problem with this. Firstly, when we talk about the doors being blown open, David Grusch just dropped a nuke. There are so many statements and broad sweeping claims here. This is anything but constrained disclosure. Here's what I would say. When you look at Arrow, when you look at the NASA conference that took place the other week, when you look at the Airborne Object Management Identification and Synchronization Group, those look like a kind of constrained disclosure. When you look at the UAP task force and the limited amount that it was allowed to say, that looks like constrained disclosure. That looks like the Department of Defense trying to say, look, we know people want to know about this. We know we're not going to get away with saying nothing. So here is a very slow and very small opening up of the doors. In contrast, David Grusch looks anything but constrained. And so in this context, I would say, I think there is a constrained disclosure happening. I think that's what Arrow is. And I think David Grusch is something completely different. And realize in the interview, who does he basically attack? It's Sean Kirkpatrick. David Grusch says that he has informed Sean Kirkpatrick of everything that he has found out, that Sean Kirkpatrick has his number, but he hasn't reached out to him. And he basically implies and indicates that Sean Kirkpatrick is being unethical, that he's not doing the right thing for the American people. So yes, I personally think there is a constrained form of disclosure going on, but it's not this. Personally, I think this looks like a real whistleblower. There are 1,000 other things that I could say here, but for the sake of trying to keep things relatively concise, I'm going to wrap up here. I'm really curious to know what you think, and especially I'm interested to know of people out there who may have different perspectives or different angles that we could look at this from, because let's face it, if what David Grusch is saying is true, the world is going to change. For any of us who take this whole subject field seriously, I don't think there's any question more important than asking, who is David Grusch, and what could his motivations be for saying some of the things that he said? My name's Jason Samosa. This has been Jason Samosa's Ufology Moment, and hopefully next time I speak to you, I'll be back home. But for now, thanks. It's been a pleasure.